and welcome to Limitless. This March, we celebrate International Women's Day and the third anniversary of Limitless, our forum for women executives to come together to share experiences and support the growth of fellow women in leadership. I'm delighted today to welcome one of our Limitless members, a woman who describes her career as having several pivots. Growing up in Ireland, Anita Sands completed her PhD in Atomic and Molecular Physics at Queen's University Belfast. Following that, she did a Master's in Public Policy before pivoting into financial services, where she spent the next decade. About 9 years ago, she pivoted again into the technology industry and a portfolio career. Her career path has taken her to Canada, the United States, and from Wall Street to Silicon Valley, and from an operating role into the boardroom. As a business leader, Anita Sands has achieved great success, having been recognised as one of the youngest Fortune 500 board members, which she describes as feeling a bit like a kiddie at the grown-ups table. Her portfolio now includes serving on the boards of several public and private companies and a stint in academia last year as a visiting professor in entrepreneurship, and this year as a venture partner at NEA, New Enterprise Associates. She's spoken all over the world on many topics, including diversity, equity and inclusion. As if that isn't enough, she's also a mum to Rosie and 5 grown-up stepchildren. We're delighted she found the time to join us today. Anita, welcome to Limitless.
Thank you so much, Ruth. I'm so honoured to be here and just so excited to be part of your celebration this month.
Thank you so much. And just reading your bio there, it strikes me, and I couldn't help but notice, of your successes, the industries you've worked in have been predominantly male-dominated, and I'm super keen to understand, how did you make that a success? Because that couldn't have been easy.
Yeah, I think I'm hoping to find an industry that isn't one of these days. Well, Ruth, it was one of those things, whether starting out in physics, I really did realize that I was vastly in the minority, and going from there kind of into banking and now tech. Unfortunately, that hasn't changed a great deal, even in the intervening 25 years. But early on in my career, I decided that I could either see this as a very intimidating factor and something that was going to cause me to sort of second guess myself at every juncture and lose my voice, or I could I could see this as a source of incredible kind of competitive advantage. And so, as I was sitting in those early meetings, early on in my career, and you're trying to think about, exposure, you're trying to think about how you grow your personal brand and your network. So I decided that being the only woman in the room was a distinct advantage. While, people might forget who the odd Paul or Mark or Chris or Matt was, nobody was going to forget who Anita was. So in some respects, that puts a lot of pressure on you, because you think, wow, everything I'm saying is going to be recognized. But I knew at an early age that I had good thoughts, I had good questions, I was able to think in unusual ways, in part because of my unusual academic background, which I had already traversed a couple of different disciplines. So I decided that, I'm going to embrace this. I'm going to see it as an advantage and make sure that I am recognized and people do hear what I have to say.
I love the way you described it as finding your voice and using it for positive advantage. And I know you a little bit as being someone who's quite gregarious and maybe more on the extrovert side than the introvert. What advice would you give someone who's kind of thinking, I really want to do that, I'm probably going to be the only female? I may not even think that, but just have that sense of intimidation or imposter syndrome that many of us get, irrespective of introverts or not. How could you help someone in that situation?
Yeah, well, I'm actually like to say I'm a closet introvert. I'm certainly fairly extrovert. I think the world makes us kind of extroverted when we're out there, but I like to recharge as an introvert. So I embrace my that side of me quite often. Look, let me just say a couple of things about finding your voice. The thing is, every woman has sort of this roommate in her mind, as I like to describe it, who's continually trying to get us to second guess ourselves. And you said, Ruth, when you're introducing me, when I sat in my first Fortune 500 boardroom at the age of 37, 38, I felt like a kiddie at the grown-ups table. And I really did. And I'm now in a boardroom. I'm at the sort of uppest echelon, as it were, of corporate life. And I went to one of my mentors because I knew this, I was inside my own head. And I love Mel Collins has this great line where she says, if you're in your own head, you're behind enemy lines, which I think is fantastic. So I went to one of my mentors and I said, look, I'm intimidated. I'm sort of looking at some of these people who have decades more experience, and he said, with all due respect, Anita, you don't have the right to be inside your own head right now, and you don't have the right to even think that way. I said, what do you mean? He said, you're there to do a job. Your job is to represent the interests of shareholders. You're in the seat, do the job. And every time I went into a boardroom after that, I really kept that in mind, that I wasn't there for myself. I was there to do a job on behalf of the shareholders I represent. And that helped a great deal, Ruth. So my trick then was I decided that I would replace kind of any time I was finding myself going down the road of comparison, I would replace it with curiosity. So if somebody framed something in a really interesting, say, diplomatic way, I would sort of literally pick up my pen and my notebook and I'd be like, wow, just capture what that person just said, or wow, wasn't that an interesting way he framed that question? And when I was able to flip my mind into that curiosity zone, I felt almost like I was back at school. Then I wanted to, I wanted to participate. I wanted to contribute to the conversation. So I subsequently learned many years later from a very good friend of mine in New Zealand who basically did her PhD on the power of curiosity, that curiosity is a superpower. And it's one of the very few emotions that can override that sort of fight-flight reaction that we have when we're deeply entrenched in our imposter syndrome. So I really would encourage people to kind of embrace curiosity as the antidote to a lot of that fear. But let me just touch on the introvert piece for a second, because if you know that you are more predisposed to be on the quieter side, also that in itself is a superpower, because the one thing the vast majority of us are not good at doing is listening and being an active listener. So I often find introverts are the ones that kind of sit back and literally sort of read the room. They hear what everybody is saying. They hear what people are not saying. And sometimes they're able to make a very, very insightful comment as a result of that. But if you do know that you have a propensity to hesitate to speak up, rig the room. Right? Rig the room in your favor. Have a friend there. And I have a very good friend she was a CHRO of several companies. So she's in super senior roles, but she's an extreme introvert. And she said, I would rig the room. And whenever I had something to say, I would hold my pen up. And my friend, my buddy across the table would say, oh, Jane, do you have something to say? It sounds like you might have a thought there on your mind. And that was a way of her friend drawing her into the conversation. So I think if you are introverted, that's a superpower in itself, but you can also sort of rig the room to work for you if need so.
I love the way you said there about also hearing what's not being said. I think that's a really valuable takeaway that I'm sure our listeners will catch on to. Talking about reading the room there, and I think that's an interesting point, those kind of cues and such, because for introverts it can be very hard to interject into a conversation, because the conversation can be quite robust and loud and perhaps be taken over by other members. The pandemic, of course, has required as many of us to be online as we are today with this interview. What advice or what observations have you made about reading the room when we're on video calls? It strikes me as perhaps not being as easy. What can we do?
Yeah, I think it isn't as easy, Ruth. You lose a great deal. So much of our communication is actually non-verbal, and it's in the form of the tone of our voice, which of course we can pay attention to on Zoom, but also our body language. It's a huge part of when you do have high EQ and you have that sort of, social awareness, being able to read the room. So look, I know that I've lost a great amount of that in the course of correspondence. And it's important, say, in board meetings, because a big part of what you're trying to pick up on as a director is, wow, do I sense some hesitation on the part of management here? Do I see real conviction in terms of what they're trying to tell us here? And you lose that. So what I do as a compensation is I spend a fair amount more time with the people in the meeting before the meeting, and if I need to after the meeting, just so I can kind of get that more one-on-one sense and sort of have a more holistic understanding of the conversation. But there's no question it's more difficult. I hope we can return to a hybrid of in-person and virtual, because it is more convenient. So what I'm encouraging all my organizations that I work with is to think very carefully about, where do we use kind of asynchronous updates and asynchronous videos or emails? Where do we use live video like you and I are using today? And where do we use in person? And being really intentional about the type of work and the type of activity we engage in each of those three sort of layers. And I hope if we all embrace that as a model, we can actually be really impactful with where we use each three of the scenarios.
No, indeed. And just kind of taking that thought that little one stage further, when we sort of look at the boardroom, you were talking about those nuances, body language, etc., and our tone. Sometimes it's vocabulary and unconsciously. And I think I read somewhere that you had perhaps been in a meeting. I'd love to explore this if I may, where a colleague had used a sports analogy to describe something, and that might seem quite innocent in its sense, and I'm fairly sure it was. It was probably used to emphasize something, but if you're not part of that world, that can feel a bit kind of, well, have I missed something? Help us understand what tips and advice you can give to someone who perhaps finds himself in a meeting forum or an executive situation where that is happening. How do you tackle it? Do you raise it? Do you just absorb it? That will happen, undoubtedly.
What's actually
Thank you, Ruth, for asking that question. It's become a bit of a running joke, actually, in some of my boardrooms because, I've been in America now for 22 years, despite I think I've still kept a bit of my Irish accent. And I'm shocked the degree to which Americans can find a baseball analogy for almost any facet of business. It's like I'm still baffled by it. So it's become a bit of a running joke. So that in itself is my answer. I use humor to kind of deter, deflect, and sort of, bring things to sort of people's attention without being very critical or acerbic about it. So that's my particular technique. But I think it is important for us to recognize that linguistic styles actually differ. And I have, as part of my class at Princeton last year, I actually taught a lecture on executive presence because I think it's one of those nebulous things that's used to sort of dismiss women or discount women. When you're, okay, Ruth is great, she's great operationally, she's fantastic at execution, but she just lacks that executive presence, that je ne sais quoi. And you're like, really? So I wanted to decode what executive presence actually was for my students. And then as part of that, we sort of dug into linguistic styles, which is what you're talking about. So when you actually look at the difference between genders and how we speak, women do things like, Ruth, and I find myself doing this in the boardroom still, and I'm reasonably confident in my domain knowledge at this stage, and I'm pretty confident as a speaker. But I find myself qualifying what I'm about to say at the start of a sentence. So I'll interject and I'll say, well, look, I may not have fully grasped the context here, but I was just thinking the following, or, I could be absolutely wrong about this. Right? And I remember one day being in a meeting and I had done exactly that, right? And then one of my male colleagues kind of came out with this really sort of flying diatribe about what he believed on a certain topic. And after quite a long soliloquy, he said, well, look, I could be wrong, but it was basically, I could be wrong, but I'm probably not. And I just remember in that moment thinking, how he and I had done the exact opposite, right? I started with I could be wrong, but, and he ended with it, but it was purely kind of, almost dismissive on his own part. So we have very different linguistic styles. And it's important, again, when I go back to sort of both genders being aware of these kinds of things, men ask questions differently. They ask questions at different times. And women, and particularly younger women, so I would catch my students on this all the time, they sort of make every comment, but they make it sound like a question. So, Ruth, if I was making a point about something, I might say, well, I think like maybe we should do the following, right? And so your inflection and your tone there makes you sound less confident, and you have less conviction around what you're saying. So linguistic styles matter, but the important thing is both men and women have to be aware of this kind of thing. And that's one of my points, Ruth, around this year's theme for International Women's Day. It's break the bias. But the thing about bias is we all have it, right? So it's not a case that, the call, in 2022 is that men have to break their unconscious or conscious biases about gender differences in the workplace. We all have to, right? We all bring those biases into the workplace.
It's a great description, and thank you for sharing that. It hadn't occurred to me, but as you're saying it, I'm nodding to say, as women, we tend to apologise at the beginning of a sentence. Therefore, we're already educating the audience to, I'm probably wrong, so therefore dismiss what I'm going to say. Whereas the example you gave was, a male colleague gave an example and then said I could be wrong, by which time everyone's already thinking on the suggestion and probably hasn't heard that last statement. And that's it's the Venus and Mars, isn't it? So some great tips and good education there. Thank you. I wanted to kind of explore a little, if I may, taking DE and I that one stage further. I know you've spoken about belonging being a really intrinsic part of inclusion. It's great that organisations can attract people into their business, but it's interesting to see how many people stay 12 months, 18 months down the line, and how comfortable they are bringing themselves that full self to work or to any other environment, even not work. What does belonging mean to you, and how do you help executive audience understand the importance of belonging?
Yeah, so I think there's a massive difference, Ruth, between inclusion and belonging, but you really nailed the difference there in your framing. It is the ability to bring your full, authentic self to work, and not to feel that you have to check a big part of your story or your life or whatever at the door when you come in. So what's incredible when you look at the research is the degree to which all of us cover or mask some facet of our lives while we're at work. And this can be anything from you change your accent, you change your name if you have a strange foreign name to something that's more colloquial. You hide your tattoos. You don't put pictures of back in the day. I've talked to a lot of senior women who were, say, in Wall Street in the 80s, even into the 90s, and they wouldn't show pictures of their kids on their desk because they felt if their colleagues walked in and saw them and their 4 kids, they'd immediately kind of start to think, oh, she's a mother of 4. She can't possibly be as committed to this job and this career as we are, and so on and so forth. But what I remind people, Ruth, is being your authentic self. It's not sort of a free-for-all kind of a card, because being your authentic self means being yourself, skillfully. So we're back to this idea of understanding the context and the environment in which you are in, and then sort of behaving appropriately for that context. And when sometimes younger people, my students, will push back and go, well, look, I am who I am. They can take me or leave me. And I'm like, well, hang on a second. Like, are you really the same person when you're out clubbing on a Saturday night with your friends as you are when you're in church on Sunday morning with your parents? Is that exactly the same version of you? And they're like, well, no, of course. And I'm like, exactly. All of us have kind of a bandwidth and a style variation. And the important piece is knowing what parts of ourselves to kind of fully, display, and what parts of ourselves we have to keep a little bit under wraps, but not doing so to such an extent that you feel like you have to fold yourself like a pretzel into, to conform with the dominant culture of the organization. And we all do and try and conform. But the other big difference, so that's one part about belonging, is sort of having the psychological safety to be yourself, and having the psychological freedom to not feel like you have to prove yourself every single day. That's super important as well. But the big other key difference between belonging and inclusion is when you belong to something, it is that you have efficacy, you have some control, you have some contribution to the entity, to make to the creation and the evolution of the entity to which you belong. So versus, oh, Ruth, welcome to our party, but Ruth, hey, it's my party. Like, you're very welcome, glad you came, but it's my music, my guest list, my food, and whenever it's over, Ruth, you don't have to go home, but I'm going to ask you to leave. Now, you're included, but belonging is when you and I co-organize the party and we choose everything together and we co-create that. So belonging is when you have the chance to co-create the thing to which it is that you belong, and that's a big and meaningful difference to people as well.
It's that willingness to participate and feeling as if there's a purpose to what you're doing. And I know that you and I, through our commitment at Thoughtworks, feel that, and we see that every day, which is why, of course, Limitless has been so supported. I also see in your coaching of women executives that you started something called Wisdom Cards. Now, I'm sure our listeners will be really keen to hear about this. Tell us a little bit about it, because it started a wee while ago.
Yeah, it did, Ruth, and it really goes back to that curiosity point I was making. I did keep kind of journals and diaries, and I had just, I was the beneficiary of a great deal of mentorship over the years. I sought out a lot of mentorship, and we could have a whole other conversation about mentors and sponsors another day. But so I had all this sort of wealth of knowledge. And then when I was off on maternity leave, 5 years ago or so, I wasn't necessarily sitting around with nothing to do, as any mother of a young baby will say, but I certainly had a little bit more time on my hands, where I just wasn't quite as intellectually engaged. And I just kind of started to read a lot, and I started making notes, and I started kind of capturing on them on these little cards. And then, because I was off for a few months, I started to sort of transcribe all of my old diaries, and so on and so forth. So now it's evolved to the point where I have over 7,000 of these sort of little gems of wisdom of all topics of all kinds. And a lot of them pertain to career advice I've gotten. I try to really absorb, I have a philosophy, Ruth, that you're better off in life learning a little from a lot of people than a lot from a few. So I go into every day, every conversation, every board meeting thinking, I'm going to learn something here. I can learn something from this person. And I capture that. So I have a special curated version of my wisdom cards coming out for International Women's Day. But what's really amazing, Ruth, is I was sort of going through my collection that pertained to sort of life, career, success, women. different cards speak to me at different points in my life. And I reflect back on sort of cards that I put up on my wall for my 40th birthday. And now that I'm 45, heading to 46 this year, it's like, wow, no, I don't need those cards anymore. They're not the ones that speak to me right now. So it's interesting how we evolve with our, our understanding of ourselves over time.
It's interesting that you touch on there about needing things at different times, and as we go through our careers, every day is very different, as we know, particularly post-pandemic. Who could have anticipated that? So when I look and read your wisdom cards, I take something from it, and I look at it as being a way of silent coaching. It's perhaps we don't need to speak to Anita today, but I'm just curious to go and read a few wisdom cards. And I think as we're all on social media these days, you flick through and sometimes you happen to see these and you read something that's very profound and it talks to you. It really helps. And you've spoken about coaching women and wisdom cards and belonging. Is DE&I now feeling like a vocation for you to start really changing industry? And do you feel it's changing from when you started your career to where you are now?
I think yes and no, Ruth, is the answer. I think on one level, I look at my students and that next generation of young women coming into the workforce, but also young men, and just seeing kind of how different their mindset is, and how different their expectations are of an equitable future. And that makes me feel very optimistic. I'd like to see the dial moving faster, at all levels. I think we've made some good inroads in terms of women in the boardroom, which is good, but we're nowhere near parity. And as I always say, we're trending in the right direction, but better is not good and good is far from equal. So we still have some ways to go. I think we still, if you look at even the latest research, that came out of McKinsey's Women in the Workplace report this year, we still have that issue with the broken first rung, right? So that is that, women making that first step onto the managerial ladder. I think women's feet are reasonably glued to the floor still. I think we have a lot more work to do on intersectionality. So, some really good stuff McKinsey had about what they were calling double onlys. So when you find yourself as the only woman in the room and the only person of color as well. And I think we all need to dig a lot deeper and really understand what those experiences are like for people. So I think we're making progress, but we have some ways to go. But the way I look at it, Ruth, is the reason why I feel it's so important is I don't see how you can be a competitive business in the 21st century without leveraging the diversity, a broad range of perspectives. As one of my friends like to say, if you're on a battlefield, it doesn't help when everybody looks through the same set of binoculars. So you really do need a broad array of opinions, experiences, perspectives, skills, if you're going to tackle kind of this changing environment that we find ourselves in every single day. So I see it as a business imperative. That's why I feel, as a representative of the long-term interests of shareholders, it's vital that I speak up about diversity, not because it's a nice thing to do, but because it's so critical for our competitiveness going forward, and particularly in industries like technology. Because when you think about, say, worlds like artificial intelligence, machine learning, right now only about 24% of the global AI workforce are female. And if you think about, even with the best of intentions, unless we have better representation and diversity of thought, we're going to create systems and platforms that will sort of embed the unconscious biases of society and do so at an industrial scale, right? So as I like to say, if we keep going the way we're going in tech, we will end up amplifying the opinions of some and we will just sort of magnify the silence of others. And that worries me a great deal. I think if we don't resolve this, we're sort of putting humanity on a plane that's flying on only one wing. And I don't see that as a good outcome for anybody.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And I just kind of want to help add and contribute to that. The FTSE this week produced results. It says 40% of women on their board, 40% of their members on their boards now are women. That's got to be positive and got to be good. And yet it's the same week as the security convention in Munich had 40 attendees for a luncheon to discuss the cybersecurity and the way that we build protection. Every attendee was male. Now that means there's no female voice at all helping with the big industrial solutions and protection of citizens go forward. So whilst we're now addressing it in the boardroom, we don't appear to be addressing it more broadly than that. That clearly, as you called out, is a concern, and it's one that's a concern, which makes me wonder now how many boards are addressing this as a tick box exercise versus those who are creating belonging, who are actually seeking to not just embrace D&I because it's the current thing to do, but it's the right thing to do. So thank you so much for sharing your insight there. I'm going to close today. Firstly, congratulating you on a hugely successful career in many, many diverse industries, but wondering what advice you would give your 18-year-old self.
Well, Ruth, first of all, thank you for this conversation. I feel like you and I could just chat for hours and have no end of topics that we could talk about. Wow, advice from my 18-year-old self. I wish I had understood just how important self-awareness was. I always kind of had a reasonable degree of it. I worked hard on it, but now that I look back and I see, wow, that's like a real secret sauce that most leaders have is sort of this ability to know themselves, to know how they are perceived by others, to how they show up in a given room, in a given context. And so I think I did a reasonably okay job, but I wish I had gotten my head around that concept sooner. I think one of the things I did right, but so I would tell my 18-year-old self to double down on this, is I invested in my communication skills at an early age. I started public speaking in high school. I competed, at a national level. And then I kept up that kind of training all the way through college, right into my early 30s. And then I went back to it with a couple of years later when I was finding myself really out there on the professional speaking circuit. I needed to, sort of up my game a little bit and take some of the rust off my techniques. But the ability to have, speaking and communicating is a skill, but it is one that we use absolutely every day, whether it's a one-on-one conversation or you're speaking to an audience of thousands or you're interviewing for a role, whatever it might be. But it's a skill that you can learn, it's a skill that you can practice, and it's a skill that you can improve on. And I think, when I was very young and finding myself as the youngest woman and the only woman in those rooms all those years, the fact that I was able to articulate my opinion with a level of kind of confidence and projection and executive presence that kind of belied how I felt inside, that carried me a long way. So I think that's another bit of advice I'd probably give myself. And the last bit would be really don't date those bad guys. They're just not worth it. Wait to find a good one. I found a great one in the end, but it took me 40 years. So I wish I'd gotten my head around that one sooner.
You got there. As we learned in life, you has to kiss a lot of frogs. Look, thank you so much, Anita. That was your tips and advice were inspiring and insightful. So thank you for your generosity. We were just delighted that you joined us today and took time to share. So thank you so much.
You're welcome, Ruth. My pleasure.